So 2 weeks ago, I thought it was a pretty good session. Lots of questions, lots of interaction, so that was good. It was a bit daunting though, wasn't it, when you think about what's involved in this design management business, and pretty hard to stitch it all together in a couple of hours. But Shara from Ignite set the scene with a view from the architects and how it should be done from their point of view. And that was a good way to start. I think we needed to understand from both sides of the fence, if you like. So thanks for that, Shara. That was a great session. Then we had the godfather of design management in New Zealand, Jamie, here. So he was doing design management before there was even a name for it. So I think that started to open all of our eyes on that it ain't a part-time job, eh? I think that was the key thing from Jamie. If you're trying to do this properly, you've got to roll up your sleeves, dive right in, and it's not a part-time job. To have a real impact, it's full-time. So that was, and he had lots of systems and amongst all that. And then next up, Dan from Icon. Now I have to admit that I think that's something that the Aussies do a bit better than us. But Icon have done a fantastic job around the town, and I think you're really going to enjoy Dan's presentation from his angle. We'll have a break about 4:30, have a quick cup of tea, and then Jennifer, you're really going to get a lot out of Jennifer's presentation, because as we said at the start, the three previous presenters are all talking about doing things properly. And we know that it often you get handed a set of documents and things just haven't been done. The design management hasn't been done enough, or there wasn't enough time for design, and you end up with a poorly coordinated set of documents, and the boss says, go build it. And there's a lot of design management you have to do on the run. So that's Jennifer's patch, and so looking forward to that. Now, if you haven't filled out the form at the front, remember to fill out that form for us. That would be good. And just one last thing. So with the design management, very tightly with that in lots of areas is BIM and digital. So a few will be interested. So we've got a conference coming up in March, which we've been running for a few years, the BIM conference, but now it's more BIM digital. So look out for that if you're interested in that side of it, how BIM interacts with design management and those sorts of things. Look out for that on the website, and that's in March. But let's hear from these Aussie boys and see what they've got to say.
Jeez. Shall I clarify that I'm a Kiwi? I just happen to work for a company that started in Australia for my sins. Thank you. The way I sort of compartmentalise this series is, and apologies in advance if I swear. Unfortunately, I've got a mic on me, so it's going to be recorded forever, and I'll try not to swear today. But anyway, the way I compartmentalise the last session and what we're doing today is, Shara was why have a DM, design manager DM. Jamie was kind of like the role in the process and kind of like the expectations you would expect a DM to cover. And today's more about transitioning into doing. So my part of it is around pre-construction and planning. Think you're a builder and you might have just won a job and you're at the back end of developed design and you're gearing up to start. Whereas Jennifer's more about you're in the middle of construction delivery and these are the tools you're using. Right, so rough agenda. I'll talk through an introduction about myself. It's pretty boring, we'll do it as quick as we can. design evolution, team structures, technical strategies, cost management. That's something we'll do at a high level because we could be here all day, talk about buildability and then getting into programming. So I was asked to do a little bit about me, so I'll try, bear with me. All right, here we go. So I was terrible at school, and that was the first time I didn't swear about that. That was awesome. We're doing all right. So yeah, I found out at the age of 10 that I have dyslexia, and made a whole heap of sense about why I couldn't read or write while I was still at school. We moved to Auckland from Tauranga, and my mum pulled me out of school and taught me herself. So I was out of the education system for a while, and I slowly caught up and was able to re-enter school at fifth form. Fifth form back then, which is a long time between drinks. But when I came back, I was in reasonable form. And
is this why you work so well with the Australians, because you're a bit slow?
100%. That's it. Yet faster builders. Irony, you know. Anywho, so then I went back to school and I discovered photography in my 6th or 7th form year, and that was massive for me. It was something I was good at academically, which was a first. I had to go to uni, I decided, and I figured photographers don't get paid very much. Why would I do that? I'll go be an architect, surely they make heaps of money. And that's a bit of an inside joke. Anywho, I did architecture at uni. It was back when it was a double bachelor 5-year thing, and I got sucked into doing a master's. So I was there for 6 years, which was a long time. I had to pay my way through it by working in a kitchen company for my best mate's dad. I was a kitchen salesman, and I sucked. I was awful, which is ironic given my most recent role of a new business person. And what ended up happening was I got good at design, and I got good at working on the assembly line and project managing kitchen installations. And off the back of that, I started drawing up people's renovations for them. So I started a drafting practice while at uni, got the biggest PI policy I could contemplate, which was adorably enough $100,000. I figured nothing in life couldn't be solved with $100,000. And I chucked buildings through resource consent and building consent. Auckland Uni was really good at teaching you how to draw live nudes, but not so good at the building code. So I just picked up the building code and had a crack. By the time I got through uni, I was completely burnt out. It was just too much. The GFC was kicking on. There was no work. And I'd always played music, so I travelled through the States in my now wife's band, and had a pretty great 18 months or so playing in this band. Lived in the back of a Scooby-Doo van, travelled from town to town playing for meals. But you know, the GFC hit the record label industry too, and there was no one was willing to sign our weird little geeky band. So we're flat broke, and I think the low point for me was sleeping in the snow in our van in Boston, and I went, I just can't live like this anymore. So with her consent, I took my now wife's girlfriend at the time, last $1,300 and flew to Sydney. The guy who got me a job at the kitchen factory, he was working at a company called Southern Cross Constructions in Sydney. Got my first paycheck, flew my wife over, and we started a life with nothing in Sydney, and had a great time. So I was there for, I don't know, about 6 years, something like that. Unfortunately, Southern Cross, great builder, terrible developer, and they had a couple of bad developments that turned them upside down, so I went to ProBuild. Ironically, actually, Icon actually bought Southern Cross, so a lot of my old friends still work for Icon today. Went to ProBuild, had a good project, and then got put into a distressed job. So 4 years into my career, they made me a project manager to bring home adaptive reuse of a 1930s heritage listing building that almost fell over. And you know, a $12.5 million PI claim later and PC, we got through it. And there was an opportunity to move back home to New Zealand. ProBuild was trying to set up an office, didn't quite work out. We were having kids. It was great to be home. Had a misguided year at Fletcher's. Apologies for anyone that works at Fletcher's on the NZICC Convention Centre. And as soon as there was an opportunity to get out of that hellhole, I went to Icon. So at Icon, I was the second employee when we started with a blank sheet of paper in July 2017. And I was a PM, then a new business guy, and I've just been put into the position of GM. So a little bit about Icon. We're owned by a huge Japanese company called the Kojima Corporation, founded back in the 1800s. Icon itself was founded in Melbourne in 97. Kojima acquired Cockram Constructions, who had done some stuff in New Zealand before, and merged Icon and Cockram together. We established Icon in June 2017. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of a publicly listed development company, construction company. Icon itself, bit COVID affected, but we turned over 1.4 billion, 800 employees across Australia and New Zealand. Kojima, they're much bigger than us, obviously, so they turned over 24 billion last year and 1,500 global projects. They're a giant. So New Zealand, we've finished 5 jobs. The Pacifica was our first standalone job. The other 2 were done in joint venture with Lees. Historically, we just completed this 500-room hotel with Ignite in May. At the moment, we've got stuff under construction, and they're going okay. And we've got some great stuff coming up. We're trying to get into civic infrastructure and more big towers and master planning stuff. So that's enough about who I work for and what I've been up to. Graham asked me to comment on what I thought about design management in New Zealand, and specifically what the challenges are that I see. And the good thing is that we're getting it consistently wrong the whole way from the beginning to the end, right? So that means there's heaps of room for improvement. No, that was snarky. But look, I see an organisation and planning issue at the as a key issue. Everything we do has pressure to accelerate, to mitigate the design time until we start construction. The market has a technical competency issue. I actually think New Zealanders have far more broader skill bases than the Australians, but the Australians have the repetition to specialise in towers or in hospitals or other things, so they've got a lot more baked in deep knowledge, technical knowledge that they get from a main contractor level all the way down to the subs. That's the difference. And that's actually why when you put a lot of New Zealand people, and please don't do this, please stay here, put a lot of New Zealand technical people in Australia, they excel because they've got that broad, really technical knowledge, because they have to do new projects all the time. The other part about technical is compliance and QA. I don't think we do that well. Decision making is often late and ill-informed. Commercial frameworks, it's more about contracting cleanly so you know what you're delivering, because if the contract's a mess and you can't interpret the order of precedence in the design documents, how do you know what you're designing? We rely on contracts from our clients that say, this is what we want. Whether it's a construct only or D&C, you need that definition and something that you can interpret within the commercial framework. Change management is hard, yes, and design completion, that we actually don't leave it to the grad to tidy up 6 weeks out from PC, that we're actually closing out our design along the way. I see a lot of this as a leadership issue about how design management is structured and who in your business runs it. Picking up on the point that Jamie made about a design manager on a job as a full-time position, that's true for us. So we have on our jobs, we have a project manager at the top, and then a dedicated design manager, dedicated building services manager, dedicated senior site manager, dedicated commercial manager, dedicated HSE. That's obviously something you can do at the scale that we operate, but is fundamental to how we deliver. And so I'm sure everyone's seen a version of this, and over their lifetime. I see design management as a blend of the technical, commercial, and delivery strategy. Technical is really important. It is a piece, but actually understanding the bigger commercial framework and working with that, and also understanding designing for how you're going to deliver it is fundamental. Right. Moving along, sorry, I wrote some notes to make sure I stay roughly on track. So, moving into, we're in this pre-construction phase, pre-build. That's what my section's talking about today. I want to talk about the evolution of the design through that phase. And we talked 2 weeks ago about the CIC stages of design development. Here is a highly abridged version of my definition of that. So I see concept design as setting the project blueprint and the affordability. I see preliminary design as project scoping and defining what the project is. Establishing a baseline program, a baseline design, a baseline cost plan, because that is the bones of what drives your resource consent and engineering plan approval. For those who don't know, EPA engineering plan approval is the Three Waters connection approval, which is super slow. It takes a good 5 months from lodgement in my experience. Develop design, I see that as the refinement of the scope. We solve it. We just solve the design intent for all the elements. But in detailed design, we draw it, schedule it, finalise it, peer review it, and get it in. I use detailed design as the genesis of all the building consents. And then construction, this is really about building consent uplift. You can only, under statute, tag something as IFC once it's been approved by the regulator. So you get a building consent, then you can rebadge as IFC. I see this is about the shop drawing for the trades, the mock-ups, prototypes, samples, technical submissions, those sorts of things. And everyone would have had their own version of this diagram, either up their sleeves or presented to them at some point in time. But really what this is about is, working from maximum cost uncertainty and variability through the various design stages to the minimum amount of cost, flux and uncertainty versus project completion and where you're at with the completion of the job. And I think the question that this talks about that is worth pondering, and it's different for each job, is where on this continuum, earlier, later, here, is the right balance of design resolution, cost certainty, procurement strategy, and construction progression. So the way we see the design process traditionally, like in a construct-only, everything's going well. And I've sort of optimized these durations, right? Assuming that cost planning and client approval happen within these gaps. But we sort of, from a time frame of awarding the consultant team and assembling them, the old rule of thumb is 8 weeks for concept design, 12 weeks for preliminary design, a good 4 months, 20 weeks for developed design, a good 5 to 6 months for detailed. Off that, historically, that's where you tender and get a builder, and we negotiate and we start. So, you're starting on month 24. So it's a huge journey. Side note, building consents for anything over 30 million in my experience, I would stage the building consents, partially because it lets you get an advantage of an earlier start date if you want, but also it's about completion. How you set the building consent strategy up from the start has to be cognizant of how you're going to get CCCs and complete it. So a big part of what our design managers do is that we might have a superstructure consent. We want to get that submitted for CCC, 6, 8, 10 months out from completion. So that's kind of a traditional process. And then so the variations we're seeing is the old, we got to 100% developed design, then we want to run building consents off an advanced detailed design pack for some foundations, and then we'll get structure in there, and then we'll see how the rest goes, and we want to tender off developed design. We'd normally wrap that in a D&C context, but equally in a construct-only context, that could be P&G and margin, early works tendering, and then once you've got everything else completed, you can then procure the rest. We often get this, putting together a fixed price lump sum D&C proposal of 50% developed design, completing it concurrent with developed design. There's a trick to that. That's not what today's about, I guess, but what you're seeing is this pressure of putting all of this consenting and tendering and risk transaction moving forward, which is really different to what we used to do. And then there's also the idea of chucking an ECI in there, and we typically do an ECI on every job. I think there's one that we haven't done it. And often it's during the preliminary design and developed design phases, and then progresses on an open book basis. And I guess what is all this doing? It's pulling from a 24-month gestation to construction start to a 15-month. And if you think about cost of design, how much you complete before you lock in with certainty, land holding costs, all those sorts of things. Those are the things that it's driving. So I guess the question is, why the hell does that matter? We're here to talk about design. What I take from that is that design management happens in a framework which is highly commercial, right? It's based on market dynamics about sales, about the cost of construction, about how fast you can get to site, how quickly you can indicate to the market you're starting construction so that they get more sales away. All these other pressures that are forcing us out of a really traditional linear process. So that's important. It's important to understand that commercial framework so you can deliver within it. Then there's the other point of, well, non-linear staged overlapped processes are very much the norm now, certainly in our experience. But the other part to it is that traditional is not cracked up to, isn't that good either, right? There are opportunities that you miss. I mean, certainly under a traditional process, you could spend 24 months going down a pathway, maximum expenditure on design, at the last minute find out about the construction cost. It's a blow up, you can't afford it, and you go into 6 months worth of abortive redesign and VM. So that doesn't help either. And the other problem with a linear process is the traditional thought about it is that it sort of segregates things. It segregates designer from constructor and things like that. So there's an incredible opportunity with overlapping, in my view. There's an incredible opportunity with bringing the builder and the subcontractors and your supply chain earlier into it, in a way where they actually have some skin in the game. And 2 weeks ago I made a comment about how many examples of bad ECI outcomes have you seen out there because the builder gets onto an ECI and puts his B team on there while he finishes chasing the competitive work, right? The issue about ECIs and early engagement is that you have to have some kind of skin in the game. There has to be some kind of penalty if you don't perform, so that you're more empathetic with the client, you're more driven. Anyway, where was I going to? There's opportunity in it to do better, but that opportunity is based on a collaborative approach with strong leadership. Well, that's what you need, and for me, that means, in how we operate, it means high transparency and a high trust model. You can't hide information from others. So within that context, let's take a look at how we'd structure a team. So pretend we're looking at a circa $100 to $150 million job. This is one of ours in town. The design team we would have looks something like this. It's quite a number of bodies. Lazily, we talk about producer statement authors first. So architect, structural engineer, facade engineer, the PS1 authors for the building services. This might be a Becker or someone like that, or it might be broken up. And then fire engineering. Then we have our specialist designers, so we'd have a geotech, a wind engineer, acoustic engineer, accessibility consultant, seismic restraint, passive fire, environmental, EPA. And then we'd have all these peer reviewers, and again, kind of lazily referred to as the PS2 authors. So it's a huge beast, and it's a lot of bodies to manage. And having all of those people at the table at the right time is essential to avoid the whole abortive work issue, right? The last thing you want to be doing is far down in a structural strategy on a big transfer, only just talking to your peer reviewer when you're going to detailed design documents. You actually need to start solving those big philosophical questions with your peer reviewer and PD and develop design. We, just as a side note, we use the producer statement system like everyone else does, but council is the minimum, right? And I think a big thing about when you're working at a certain scale of project is that, a mechanical PS1 and PS4 for G4 ventilation isn't going to cut it on a 40-something story tower, right? So what we actually want is a peer review that checks broad code compliance, aside from what council is just looking for, but also our compliance with the obligations of the contract. So in a design and construct world, we'd have some principles, requirements, we'd have a reference design that we need to comply with. So we use these peer reviewers to broadly check compliance. And then we also ask them to look at value management, right, or value engineering, because one issue with these guys is that they become a ratchet every time they add more, and we keep adding more reinforcement or whatever else there is. So we try and cut it both ways by saying, that's cool, you've got to get through a PS2 peer review process, but we're also looking for VM contribution and certain staging of reviews to try and bring them into the team a bit more.
So you write that into their contract, that they've got to look at value management, value engineering as well?
Absolutely, yeah, we do it on staged reviews. It works at the back of a milestone pack or something like that. They've got to have some kind of investment that forces them to not always add more stuff.
Do they push back on that, or are they happy to do that?
I haven't had pushback yet. I think the thing you've got to remember is that these people are acting on behalf of council. They're putting a council hat on. Traditionally, instead of having a PS2 author, you'd have a building council officer doing these reviews for you, but we can all agree that there's no way in the world that getting a council person to look at a bespoke tall building is going to make any sense, so you get peer reviewers in to act on council's behalf. So there's a line they have to walk where they are technically acting on behalf of the regulator, but that doesn't have to mean that the regulator's always pushing it up. They have to check that we're complying with code. How we engage people, well, it's pretty straightforward. We've got a standard CCCS that we use, and probably everyone uses a pretty similar beast. But because our entry point on a job could be concept design, it could be developed or detailed, it's quite broad. We have to have quite a broad set of scopes. So we have a generic contract and then a really detailed scope structure. We put in, actual project description, summary of the services, that sort of thing, because, if we make a design change along the way, we're happy to be measured against that, right? If we change the GFA and it increases, then there should be some consideration on some level around the design fee to do that. We have a bunch of general requirements, so and program requirements, what certificates and warranties we need, meeting attendance, QA. Big thing for us is we insist that all design consultants for us have a QA plan and we audit them on it. And then documentation and reporting requirements. We have a discipline-specific scope, so this is really describing the what, what are you designing? In this case, it's an architecture one, so it's architecture and interiors, what builders works we want them to take control of, that sort of thing. And then section 4, and you can do this a different way. You could just grab the CIC list off the internet and tick boxes about deliverables, but this is about, if that's the total in-game service that you want, this is about how it gets delivered to you incrementally throughout the design journey. And then a bunch of stuff about BIM, which we'll get into in another forum. So that's how we approach setting up a team. It's a huge number of people to manage. Then we develop a technical strategy, all right, of how we're going to deliver it. For us, this is based on a design and construct project where we've won it off 100% developed design, and we take over control of the consultants and deliver detailed design. That's pretty common for us, but you could apply this logic to anything. So we have this side over here which requires an ICON project leadership and SLT sign-off from our business, right? To make sure that we've got the overall structure for the design management right. We look at the engagement and innovation of the consultant. So that's the scope of works, that's the CCS, that's what we use, CCCS, sorry. And then the fee schedule. Everyone's got a fee vetting schedule, that sort of thing. So that deals with the dollars. We have to figure out what our code compliance path is. So that'll be, how are we consenting under what parts of the building code are we using? Where are you using acceptable solutions or alternative solutions? And what's the breakup of our consents and how are they staged? We have this thing called the PCCF, crappy acronym, damn it, I wasn't going to swear. A crappy acronym that I'll remember exactly what it means, but it's like Project Consent Compliance Framework or something. So we pull that together to know how we're going to deal with a regulator. Then we've got a certification place, which is about what producer statements and broader design certs we're expecting per stage. Design certification and site observation templates. Normally there is something provided in the contract, but we need a baseline. We have a design program, and then we've got a design management plan, which is becoming more and more standard, that you have a design management plan across any kind of job. That goes through a hold point for approval. Concurrent to that, there's stuff around the design team mobilisation. When we take over control of the design team, we need to brief them about what we're going to do. So we've got a resource consent tracker, which maps the conditions of the resource consent against the building consents. What value management needs to be redocumented and converted, and then also what subcontractor design. We're heavily reliant on subcontractor design typically for ICON. So what are the things that who do we need to engage and what are they doing? That leads to a design team kickoff, and we start detailed design and have various safety and design change management registers, design change notice, design certifications, and hold point reviews leading to sign off. So a couple of those key docs, right? So this is what I mean by a resource consent tracker. Terrible, laborious, yeah mate?
Sorry, who manages all these documents? Is it the design manager who manages, because there's quite a few active tracking documents? Is it fundamentally his responsibility, or you guys?
That's why you've got a design manager full-time on every job. And often we have a coordinator or a graduate supporting them. But you got to, like from our perspective, if we take headline risk on design, you have to resource it. So that you can stand behind it, right? One of the great things about working for a company owned by a large Japanese company is that you've got balance sheet and bonding capabilities to do whatever you want. The bad side of it is that you can never wind up that business, right? Because they're listed and they can never justify shutting down a business unit. So that means that you actually just have to deal with the risk. And I think of guys like MetLife Care who do a lot of in-house design management, and you have to manage these design risks as a long-term asset builder and owner. These are things you kind of have to be across. But yeah, it is kind of eye-opening once you get into it. So, yeah.
Just on the taking on risk, so you might be novating designers as opposed to starting new. What's your process there just to manage that risk?
Both. It depends on when we get engaged, but typically it's novation off the back of, say, developed design. We review their contracts, which are often not signed, and often have to deal with closing that out. There'll be a form of novation which we have an opinion about and what happens with backwards looking liability. And then we go through our standard scopes and do a gap analysis with each consultant, and often that means there is an increase, particularly around construction monitoring. But we also know we can't get through council without all that stuff, so what's the point? Right, resource consents. So we take each of the conditions, who's responsible, what action's required, which consent it relates to, and status. So we track those because we don't want to be tripped up by them when we're lodging for a building consent. There it is, yep, Project Consent and Compliance Framework, great name. The intent around this was that we didn't want to have a whole heap of building consent delays. We'd heard when we started the business about all the pains with dealing with Auckland Council. So what we focused on was, well, we're a business that gets to choose what risks we take. Council is a regulator that has to underwrite buildings that they don't have much say in. So we thought, out of courtesy, what we'd do is we'd start with telling them what we're up to and how the project's structured, what it's about, some of the compliance pathways we're going through, and give them visibility of our team and their credentials and those sorts of things. Then, again, we go through the building consent stagings and scopes and mark up documents and add that in. And then we start the outline of our completion compliance framework. So, we have a CCC template that we tend to use. So we'd put that in to say, look, this is the document we'd start with working with you on. The reason we do this is that there's certain different levels of customers you can have with council. We're a premium customer, so we get the same person every time. So we can work and we can get their buy-in to actually accept this document early in the consent flow. If you don't work under that model, this is something I'd recommend you prepare as a document describing the scope, the time frames, and the content of your building consents, and just do it at your pre-app and keep representing it at your pre-app. Because what I've found is that the more information we give council, and we give them our ETABS models on structures, we're very open with them, the more information we give them, the better returns we get and the more trust we get. This is a dashboard type thing. It's really hard to read, but basically to figure out what parts of the code we're going to comply with, consultants this side, subcontractors on this side, and we go through and figure out who is broadly responsible for what sections, and it's more about a visual gap check and just talking it through with the team. So, durability is going to be covered by, structure, a little bit of architecture. Oh, I can't even read that, sorry, but there'll be facade and there'll be a couple of other things in there. So we do that more as a discussion document just to get our head straight about what we're buying. Then we will start to map out what we do, what our requirements are in terms of certifications at each stage. So at concept design, we still want design certifications that the project is roughly on track within the intent of the project brief and has the ability to comply with code. In an ultimate sense, it might not be ready to do it then. And we carry those through each of the key milestone phases until we get to building consents. We get into our PS1s and 2s. And then at completion, what our expectations are around PS3s and 4s, and then our construction monitoring requirements. Certainly for every structure we do, they've been CM4 plus elements of CM5. So we're consistently seeing the construction monitoring levels being ratcheted up, but that makes it easy to get a PS3 out of someone at the end. After doing that mud map thing I showed you over here, once we've done this, we typically know how to fill in what goes into each certificate, what code references and that sort of thing, which we populate as a template, and we'd show that to council to say, hey, is this within your expectations? This is what you're going to get. And seismic, because we all love seismic, we sort of map that out as well around PS1, 2, 3 and 4 and what construction monitoring level we've got. Another key piece around our technical strategy is the right information when. And unfortunately, this isn't the best snapshot, but what we do is we sit down with our consultant teams and list out, take their drawing schedule list or whatever, and start to map out on our job when we need different kinds of things. Now, unfortunately for the architect, this is pretty clearly we need everything all at once, so hurry up. But with other people, it's different, right? And again, that's more about thinking of you can't have everything that you want straight away, so what are the steps we're going to take to get there as an output? Lastly, I'll just talk about BIM for a second in terms of technical setup. So this is consultant or designer, this is subcontractor. I've picked a section that's about structure by the looks of it. The way that we map this out is, what level of detail or LED you get at design handover, what you expect the contractor to do, what verification they have on site, quality as built, visual as built, or measured as built. And then we also at the same time map out holistically what we're doing shop drawings for technical submittals or samples, because those things become massive in terms of the expediency of moving procurement along. So that's our technical strategy. How am I doing for time? Right, I've got to hurry up. Cost management is pretty straightforward. It's a total nightmare, so don't do it. The things I wanted to just cover off here was that in this pre-construction space, it's pretty basic, right? We could talk about it all day, but really it comes down to regular cost plans throughout the design phases and structuring them in, off milestone package reviews, getting the right information at the right time and being clear what you don't need and what you can do of square metre rates, targeted market input from your supply chain on the right thing, so it could be curtain wall or something early, and sharing cost data with the design team. We find a lot of the time our design consultants get hidden from the commercial information. That means that they've got no ability to respond to budget issues. So if you give them more data, you can hold them to account more. sometimes their references to square metre rates are 10 years old and don't make any sense, but it's more about understanding the technical information about what changes a square metre rate on the facade. Is it about a fin? Is it about a bracket? Is it about a certain product? So we're pretty open with that sort of data.
Excuse me, Dan.
Yep.
When you're working through the milestones and doing your cost estimation,
Yep.
what sort of percentage of the estimation do you rely on your subcontractors, or is that all in-house from your?
No, so we wouldn't do a cost plan without some kind of subcontractor input. And then we're gradually building more and more detail on that until we get to an offer stage where it would be full competitive tender in the market.
You build all these designers on a fixed price, I guess, and then you're going to stick your cost management over it and find out your own budget, and then you're going to have a fight with your designers about whether they redesign at their cost or your cost. How do you cope with all of that?
Yeah. Oh, look, it's a good question. I tried to have a debate with an engineer for a structural steel building where we tried to get a clause in their design to budget in his contract, and he said, get stuffed. So I said, cool, design to tonnage. It's like, it's pretty much, it's a steel structure, it comes down to tons. Look, the issue I find, and I have empathy for this for consultants, is that going through, say, 3 months of PD and you find out at the end of it that it's over budget and you've been given all these signals to keep going, and then trying to fix a budget blowout while concurrently pushing develop design, those things don't go together, right? And you can only hold people to account when you're sharing information. So if you're not accurate early about, say, go back to a curtain wall, it's 1,500 a square metre, that's what we're targeting. We can't afford that amount of GRC on it. What else can we do? Is there another product? And you actually engage them. How else can you make them accountable, right? How else do they know that your cost planning is reasonable, right? And not egregiously wrong. So I think it cuts both ways, right? Unless you share data and spend the time having the conversation, you can't hold people to account.
But I think that's how big the cost management part of design management is. It has to be a lot.
Yep. It is.
Otherwise, you do end up at the end of the stage with a project that doesn't quite work.
What you need to focus on, there'll be a series of key rates that matter, and then a bunch of stuff that doesn't. You know what I mean? The basement's always going to be, if you have a basement, a big thing, a big cost item, and not one anyone wants to pay any money for, right? The facade's always going to be contentious, and inevitably it feels like you have a big blowout on structure and facade, and then you have to deal with it in the finishes, which is the only thing that the people that occupy the building care about, right? And it just feels backwards. So that doesn't mean to say that we get it right. We've shared a lot of cost data and then the market's moved recently, or you incrementally work on something and it ends up going down quite a different path and you have to reset. But that's all part of it in large jobs.
It's also that incremental part in terms of the cost information is really valuable from a design perspective, as opposed to waiting to the end of the phase to find out, we're over by like 30%. You can get feedback as you go through the design, and you're really live mitigating any issues around program while having through design.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, value management versus value engineering. So anyone that you talk to doesn't want to do value management or value engineering. There's always some idiot that'll do it cheaper, and that's not value engineering, or value management, that's not what it's about. And there's a subtle difference between the two. So for me, and this is my experience of the definition, but value engineering is something where you're achieving the same mandatory outcome in a more efficient way from time, cost, or quality. Whereas value management is more subjective, it's a strategic thing, right? So a client could decide, do I want to have a Green Star rating for this building? I'm going to have to invest more capital in that, but it'll be easier to sell in the long term, and it'll have better performance. That's an overall strategy thing. Whereas what I see value engineering about is, this is Pacifica Tower, where it had a big, dirty transfer structure. You had 47 floors landing on a section of podium that then got transferred out to make a more efficient car park arrangement. we ended up coming up with a different approach, which is the pink wall there, which kept the same number of car parks and access. It was more robust structurally, saved 1.5 mil, saved a month on program, and it was easy to build. That's value engineering to me, whereas value management is, the more subjective things. Do we or don't we do this? How does it align with the value proposition of the job? My experience with VE is the risk of optimism bias. We always think it's going to be easier to pull off than it is. The amount of rework and redesign to get it over the line is tough, and then there's also a cost for the redesign. Right, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to flick on to buildability, which is another bit we get. So buildability, what is it? We don't really have a secret sauce for it, unfortunately. But the way I approach it is, you have to get into the detail. And to do that, how do you assess a set of docs for buildability? We have to do it from first principles. We all approach it differently. For me, because of my background, I do a lot of it through hand sketching and through doing little SketchUp models. So, what it is, I see it as coordination, improving robustness, temporary work, safety and design, risk management, challenging design, refining efficiency, and who, it's kind of like the safety thing, who's responsible for safety on site? We all are. Same deal with this, design manager, design team, subs and suppliers, building services manager, project engineer. So some examples of how we approach building buildability. So it's a little clunky, but you can kind of see from the numbers it goes like that and then up this way. So we're working on a transfer truss and how it connected to a core. So the only way I could understand this thing was to do a really, really basic big picture sketch in SketchUp to slowly look at how these things would get built and staged. And off the back of that, I had enough of it visually in my mind to be able to figure out how we wanted to detail the steel embedments, their connection plates, and then the order in which we were going to complete the pours. Here's one from the Pacifica. The twist in the curtain wall is really hard, as you'd expect. We didn't know how to panelise it, so we exploded it in 3D to figure out what we could do. The cap was a really difficult bit of geometry because it's cantilevered out from the slab. And we slowly worked through the assemblage to then figure out where the rotations were, and then, this was just a SketchUp model I did to understand the mullions and transoms and how we'd pull them together. So for me, a lot of it is actually just doing some of my own sketches in the background. This is a job we're doing with Simon over there, where we had to do analyses of different basement options with a secant wall option and a diaphragm wall and soldier pile wall option. And again, I'm thinking about how we pull these together in really quick fire sketches. This is the same sort of thing about how we de-stress a prop. I'm thinking about the order in which things go in and very basic sort of description of text there to be able to comment, on if that detail was going to work for us and what other weathering and other issues we had.
And which option did you choose?
On that, we went back to secant. No, we went to soldier pile, didn't we? That's right. Good thing we got the PM in the room. He knows what he's talking about. I'll talk about programming design now. And I guess this sort of goes back to that issue of we're in non-linear processes more and more in terms of overlapping different design phases. And I think the other piece to it is it sort of comes down to acceleration of design processes versus efficiency. And here's a really terrible slide, but you'll get the idea. Now, Warren Buffett said, no matter how great the talent or efforts, some things just take time. You can't produce a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant. And I try and do that on a program all the time, it never works. But on the other side, 1 woman could have 9 babies in 9 months, right? So that kind of speaks to it a bit, that there is a cost in trying to accelerate, and then also there's a loss of efficiencies in trying to accelerate that we look at. So when it comes to programming design, we think about it in a leadership sense. We tend to program the design work streams as a resource thing. Who's the leader, who's the associate that's interpreting what's coming out of the principles, documents, or whatever, sketches or markups, and what's the documentation team doing. we think about it in terms of thought leadership, which it sounds really, really pretentious, but what I mean by that is actually just staying a couple of steps ahead of your documentation team in terms of the issues you're crunching. Team management, the right resource for the right activity, trying not to have a cast of thousands in every meeting, but actually the right people there, and trusting that you can offload the information properly and that you've got an approach which lets you scale, right? Understanding the critical path, what must be done now, budgeted, or long leads or consent issues drive it, or what can wait. You can't leave anything behind, but what can wait? And then what can be scoped, what can just be communicated through intent, and what could be, what has to be fully defined at that stage. Forums, we think about, the coordination and workshop regular, solving design issues, workshops, then the DCGs, your formal weekly or fortnightly meeting. But a big thing I'm an advocate for is a Type 5, so it might be the design manager, principal from the architecture, structural and services field, and then your client rep or client PM. Just whether it's a 15-minute meeting or an hour-long meeting once a fortnight or something like that over a coffee, slowly solving the big issues and talking about what's coming up, talking about resourcing. And, that org chart I had before of the project team, they're huge, right? So actually building relationships so that you can call each other in a crisis and be aligned. That's what I use that for. Managing and mapping decisions is a key part of how we program, and then managing change is always going to be a tricky one.
So just diving into detail of your design meetings, so they could be horrendous with that number of people. How do you structure your design meetings so you can, so you don't have cast of thousands, so how do you get through them efficiently?
Yeah, it's got worse with Teams, right? Or Zoom, because you've got so many people on a Teams call with their mics off and their cameras off, not participating, but just saying that they've been there while they clear emails or do some drawings, and that's really frustrating. So I personally, because I'm a bit of a control freak, well, I was when I used to do more design management, was really prescriptive about who could be there, and that, if you go back to the forum, that of course you're going to have a cast of thousands in a coordination workshop, because you've got all of the people, say you're dealing with a building services issue, you might have all the mechanical people and all of the structural people to solve an issue. But this should be smaller. The DCG should be about who's got road blockages, what are we scheduling? We need a workshop to solve a parapet issue. Who are the people that lead that and go do that? There's no reason a DCG should be an hour and a half or 2 hours. They should be 45 minutes based on where we're at, who's got a blockage, why can't we hit the targets we're about to hit, what do you need? So trying not to do design in a DCG is counterintuitively a really important thing, I find. And then you have the senior piece around the Type 5 to make sure that you're connected with your lead guys and driving them in the right direction. Right, so how we are planning logic. So you need a structured, disciplined, measurable process, right? Something you can actually track where you're going. And the problem with design evolution is that it kind of wobbles all over the show. It's not like something you can measure like productivity of building a slab. You need to understand what has to happen in parallel, what can happen concurrently. And understanding the construction methodology and program, going back to your compliance strategy, how you're going to get each of your consents, what decisions you have to have and when, what do you need from your client. I like to chunk the design into themes so that I can compartmentalize them, focus the workflows, working in cost reviews, and then design QA, which we see, design review, which we see as QA, compliance, risk, safety and design, and buildability, and design approval, and contingency. You need program contingency in your programming logic. So my process is really about, I take a big picture step back from the program. I look at the development program and the construction programs and try to smash design in between the two of them and see what it takes for those two things to coexist. Often there's not enough time, so we need to think more laterally. Focus on what the compliance pathway is. So if I know timing around resource consent submissions, EPAs, building consent flows, then you can match the design to suit that. That works backwards off your construction program. Obviously, you need your design consultant scoped up with the right deliverables at the right time to match your big picture program. Mapping out what contractor design essentially you need when. A lot of the time in our D&C jobs, we actually use our subcontractors to do the PS1s for facade, building services, those sorts of things instead of the consulting engineer. So that's a big piece, being clear on your subby design. And then establishing design management processes and controls, so actually getting the management plan up, the common strategy and decisions. But I start with a really, really basic programming setup. So what we might do is, the next idea was for me to show you a couple of examples of some design programs and how I set them up.
So just before you do that, so on a design, this might be a bit contentious, but in my experience, you're talking about design and construct, and it's not that common in New Zealand. It sort of goes through stages where it comes and goes. But the designers from Australia are used to working in that arrangement. So I might get a kick from Shara here, but some of the larger Australian consultants are used to working in a design and construct way, whereas a lot of the New Zealand consultants are used to more of a traditional approach.
Yeah.
How do you go about sort of selecting your team? Do you come across that, or?
Well, look, it shouldn't be an issue for them, right? Because you still have the same amount of design to complete. It's just who's controlling that pathway. Typically, we have more efficient design processes under D&C. Typically, we have better feedback processes, and that might just be because we're good at operating under that model. And there are heaps of people that do traditional construct-only design management processes really well too. Half of the jobs we have on the books right now are construct-only and the rest are D&C. What's interesting though is that we still have a design manager on each of the jobs, we still have a services manager, and the difference between the D&C and construct-only ones is that on D&C we typically have 2 commercial resources, and on the construct-only we've got 5 or 6. It's out of control. One of our construct-only jobs we have 5,000 instructions after 20 months of build, and it's just phenomenal. So David Hayes from Thermosash always says, you have to get into the detail at some point, right? You're always going to get there. And I think my perspective on it is that I kind of don't care whether we're D&C or construct only. We have to invest in good design management even when we're helping our clients, or whether we're driving the process, because it de-risks delivery for us. Like as a builder, the market's a mess, right? We're not making any money out of trade letting at the moment. If anything, it's all going the wrong way. The only way we can perform and meet our targets is to finish on time. So I see design management as more about program protection and completion. Actually, Shara kind of touched on it, whether you're formally the design manager leading something or whether you're, like in our construct-only jobs, influencing that around the formal delegated design manager, it has to be done either way. You have to get into the detail at some point.
Does it not become more design coordination and that build only?
Well, I guess the thing is that it still takes a design manager. It takes that caliber of resource, and the hard thing too is, these provisions around competent, builder should reasonably understand or foresee, right? Well, the only way to be able to understand something and foresee it is to get into the detail, and someone's got to do it. And the hard thing about design management on a construct-only job is we do it defensively to protect what happens out in the field. Because if we don't do it defensively, what happens in the field is our guys get frustrated and build something anyway, right? I probably shouldn't say that, you can delete that bit. But you know what I mean? Because the program pressure comes and you have to finish. And actually we find, we get better outcomes on site when we're on the offensive leading design. But you also kind of need, it is a bit horses for courses. Like we're great at leading design from detailed design onwards, when everything has to be black and white. But when it's sort of grey through concept design up to developed, we're not that good at that. You know, there are a couple of people in our business that are, but you know, builders are better at making things crystal clear rather than leaving enough room for it to move around a little bit.
Can I just ask, you know, I'm going back slightly to that item 4 around kind of getting the contractor to kind of start participating in the designs. That comes back to like whether you're going to have a commercial opportunity or not, like engaging subs early, I guess, in order to resolve the design. Is that sort of like a balance that you have to weigh up every project, or do you have a clear view that actually we're just, you know, we can't kind of wait to go out to market, we need to get going on these elements and get it fully resolved?
I think it comes down to, well, the job we're doing out at the airport, construct only, but we're taking the lead on design for the facade, right? So we clearly need the facade team there right away. So they were there from the beginning of an ECI process. Then structural steel became the next lead time issue, so we had to understand that and sort of work backwards from there. So we engaged them on a early subcontractor involvement thing to get procurement and other things away. So subcontractor involvement formally, I work backwards from the construction demand and who's doing what in terms of certification. But as a builder, I mean, Icon's 100 people and none of them carry a hammer. So we're only as good as our supply chain. So the best risk mitigation for us is to, be really selective about who we work with and to pull them in to our cost planning and design management processes. I actually don't know another way around it, because otherwise we're just talking bullshit, you know? We can't pretend that we're a piler, but we know the guys we'd use.
And the commercial side of that isn't a problem, like just in terms of that competitiveness. That seems to be what we hear in terms of pushback around, nominating a particular system.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, but equally, you could nominate a system but be open to alternatives even in a construct-only environment, right? There are times when it's other pressures why you might not want to do that, right? So if you're thinking about, one we always get down to is window suites on a, punch window system on a building, right? And what do? Is it, Fairview, APL, or the thermosash system? And it can't be thermosash because you need competitive tension, and you want to have another couple of options in there, and it is hard, right? But yeah, we typically run on a basis of we'll accept alternatives or try pull that engagement in really early, because the reality is that you can still, off very high level information, get a good size of the quantum of windows, what the design intent is, and make some decisions, bring them in a paid or preferred contractor arrangement, and then make them accountable for, this is the budget we set back in the day. When you became preferred, you need to be within a couple of % of that, otherwise we will exercise our right to run a full commercial process. And that's where it comes back to, they have to have skin in the game just like we do. They have to be fighting to get the job started. Okay. Do you want to take a quick break while I set up a little programming exercise and just hand out some papers and quickly run through how I'd go about programming and show you a challenge? So, design programming and how we approach it in this sort of phase of the pre-construction piece. What I thought I'd do is just sort of show you some logic around how we approach it, and then kind of do a quick exercise here, because I guess the question comes down to is what you prioritise and what you let be delayed versus your construction activity. So this is a very high level. There's actually, most of the time I don't work in project, most of the time I work in PowerPoint, as embarrassing as that is. And then once I've got the big picture sorted, I'll then get into detail in project or P6 or something like that. But so this is a nominal 40-storey tower in town. And we had a three-stage ECI engagement. They wanted us to cost plan at the back end of concept design, get through PD, and try get to construction in 10 or 11 months, which was pushing the proverbial uphill. So we looked at, well, how do you work backwards from that start date and that ambition? And so this is the very basic way that I approach it, and hopefully I can just widen that, it might be easier. Where we look at award and mobilisation of balance of consultants. There was a lot of redefinition of the blueprint of this building to do. It had a previous consent that wasn't feasible, so it was a complete do-over. So we were looking very, very high level on a yield and structural configuration that could fit that, based on a VE exercise we'd done. We were looking at helping the client develop the project brief, because what often happens is that the brief gets done at the end as an afterthought, so we wanted to bring that further forward. And then we were trying to match our construction methodology to this blueprint from the outside so that we could get a really nice homogeneous tower design. Then the idea was to, off that blueprint, which was, for us, we were happy with, trace paper sketches or something like that, but just something to sort of validate this alternative concept, to then let us do some further cost planning and programming analysis on that volume or that mass. Concurrently, that gave the consultant team some time to update reports and update models, and we could build a bit of a proper project brief about what we were working on. Had 1 week for client approval, which is pretty ambitious. We were looking for a rubber stamp straight away. Concurrent to that, given the time frame, we were considering marketing documentation, how do we maximise the sales campaign for the primary sales to enable us to get construction financing for the client, and then what could happen later. When the resource consent, it was a new resource consent, had to go in, what happened with EPA and that sort of thing. So we're trying to get to that blueprint really quickly so that we could run the ruler over it and start going into marketing material and resource consent information really quickly. And we had quite a truncated, is what I'm trying to say, preliminary design process, again because we're working with an existing strategy that we were tweaking. And we started thinking about the contract documents, so the principles, requirements, taking the brief to what was the end state things, what were going to happen in the contract from a performance perspective. We wanted to be 50% preliminary design complete before we lodged any of our resource consent or EPA or marketing documents, because we wanted to know that roughly in this super tight process, the preliminary design was drawn, was in a Revit model, was looking about right, and we weren't lying on the renders for the marketing information, essentially. So that validation was important. We had a traffic management issue we needed to crunch very quickly. And then after that, we were able to get into a bit more of a normal process around develop design. I've got to say, I hate nothing more than having to do a cost plan concurrently to the start of a design phase, but that's what we had to do here. Going through develop design, we then did cost planning, which was fully trade-backed, so we gave ourselves a bit of time to work through that. And we're actually willing to fix our P&G and margin and the enabling works at that phase. We felt we had enough project definition from this preceding stuff. Then we continued a pretty normal develop design stage, and following that we were going into a D&C tender process, which would culminate in us taking over detailed design and pushing forward. But we needed to get an early works contractor engaged and advance detailed design around the early works. So that's what we were thinking about with an advanced building consent 2, which was the foundation package, an advanced structure package, which we were trying to overlay, because in developed design we were saying, as long as we get the blueprint right early and commit the form working systems for that tower, we're pretty locked. Then we can work top down and get into the geometry of the foundations and the piles here and lock them and start committing that engineering early. This was a hell of a process, and I used to have more here, and but we did get through it. But those are sort of the tensions that we're looking at. The actual program itself that we generated, sorry, I'm just a bit clunky with this mouse, looks something like this, which was pretty detailed. The dark purpley colour is us doing a methodology thing, green is doing a financial thing, and then design is in blue. And we're looking at, and I won't get into the detail of it, what you have to do in a linear way, and when that unlocks another work stream around, say, facade or whatever else, or other building consent work streams. So we're really thinking about the minimum design, when you have to have it, and when, and going into a fair bit of detail. This is about an office tower, this one. Similar sort of process, but a much more logical. I think preliminary design's really, really important. My advice would always be to get to the end of PD and then do a full cost plan and method then, because at that point, you know what this building is in the macro sense, with enough definition to really get a detailed measure going where you can get some trade input, and you should have enough info on the program. That client was in a particular hurry and wanted to us to tender off 50% developed design. So then we started thinking about how we'd do that. This diagram's really more about us considering when we have to freeze what, right? So macro freeze for us, that meant on this tower, it meant the mega columns and those sorts of things. When we had to, what period we were locking in intent and scope, when we were doing a cost plan and measure rate, what the client was doing, and then through the develop design stage, because we were just looking for performance brief level information, what steel detailing and buildability input we needed to be able to lock off structure. We were looking at bringing the facade visual mock-up unit on early to make sure we had the curtain wall right. We decided we actually could deal with, in that building, it had very limited building services because it was more future provision, so we realised we could deal with very high level schematic and spec information for that job. And it really helped. And so what we did was we focused on, well, we can prepare a tender based on the things that we know and provisionalise the finishes, and we kicked the finishes down the line. That got us to a much earlier start date. And again, the program that we get into, and the reason I'm just pulling these up is not to get into the detail, but just to kind of communicate the level of thought. So, our team is really thinking about these individual activities like we'd think about the way we build a slab or the way we install a facade. And what's interesting is that, we've got these discrete tasks here that say that we're doing something on the facade during this develop design phase. The expectation is the facade engineer's there the whole way through. But this is more communicating, mate, it's about you. We're focusing on you right now, and we're going to crack this particular issue. Then we need that locked and moved off to the side so we can unlock something else to focus on. Anywho, same sort of thing, and then we get down into how we structure our building consents, the review process, the lodge, the uplift, how that performs against the program requirements. And the last one I just thought I'd show here was actually something we did with Naylor Love as a joint venture, which was the arena in Canterbury, which we came second best on, and I'm actually to this day very grateful about that, because that was a bit too much. But what I really liked about this thing is that we started at concept design with no information to work from other than a minimum yield in terms of number of seats and areas. So we started thinking about these things of how would we quickly through an award period get the intent and crush the big picture and what our options are, so that we can actually have a concept design phase which was going to land at a blueprint. You can imagine with designing an arena that you could just go down endless rat holes trying to find the right solution on the building design, but actually we needed to kind of crunch the big picture in a really intense, we called it a deep dive session, for a month, co-located with the principal from the architecture firm and the principal from the structural engineering firm to crunch this thing to figure out the roadmap of roughly where we were going to go. And it follows the same sorts of things. Once we've figured out that, setting the table, getting everyone there, figuring out the big picture strategy, the blueprint, the affordability pathway, and then scoping and baseline. You see, I just kind of keep regurgitating the same garbage. But what was interesting is out of my crappy little PowerPoint presentation programs, this one became the most complex, where we're thinking about all the things we wanted to cover in the mobilisation period. There was a debrief from the principal, there was a challenge on the reference information, there was this 2-week deep dive, there were commercial things we had to do, and we wanted to land that to get to a point where we could brief our teams on what we're going to do through concept design. Then we chunked the building down into precinct, roof and envelope, bowl, and then modes, what configurations you could divide the arena up into. Fan first was this thing about stakeholder engagement and what the fans wanted and to engage them early, and then some other value add stuff. And so we're thinking about these in streams of workshop for 2 weeks. Then the principals do this bit, then the associates do the testing, and then we chuck those markups and Bluebeam documents out to our commercial teams to validate the pricing on, then get the client approval, then we could unlock documentation. So we're thinking about all these big chunks in that way. And that sort of theme followed through of, macro freeze, base build coordination, public stuff. And then we also got to the point of going, well, we're under a lot of time pressure. What's the minimum information we were prepared to put a D&C proposal on? And we said, well, we can deal with, it needs to be developed design, and we can deal with the structure and the geometry having some clashes, but it had to be defined and drawn, right? It didn't have to be perfectly coordinated. The secondary steel elements, we wanted to define them, so we're going to use Revit to put a bunch of placeholding steel around the facade so that we knew quantum, but we didn't really care about whether it clashed or if it was right. Envelope was about sketches and just definition. Building services was more about performance specs. And fit out, we just wanted to define intent and nothing more. And off the back of that, we knew what we were going to do our proposal against. And this was sort of the resulting gargantuan program that just went on for days, and I'll just kind of slip past it. But you get the idea. That's how we chunked it down. So we're going to do a really short, sharp exercise. And what's on your table is I've mapped out a super linear baseline program about a project, I don't know, the same sort of scale that we've been talking about, and what you'd normally expect in terms of concept design, cost plan approval, PD, cost plan approval, resource consent starting off 50% preliminary design normally, get to the end of PD and you're ready to lodge the resource consent. This would be council engagement. Start the EPA process. These things have to be going in parallel because you can't uplift a building consent without a resource consent or your EPA. At the end of develop design, cost plans and approval, detailed design, get it approved, get your first consent going, and then get a main contractor. And I landed at sort of mid-November as a nominal linear time frame of how we could run a design process to get to a main construction start. And roughly, using these kind of building blocks that we've got here in durations, the task is for a couple of minutes to see if you can get to an early works commencement with, I'm thinking digging a hole, pretend this thing's got a basement, so piling, starting excavation, in, what are we talking about, mid-March in this year, and assuming that's a 6-month journey before when you need to actually be doing your superstructure. So I'm thinking that's core and columns starting to come up. It might be the slab on grade 2. What would you do differently? What would you shuffle? What would you push around in the design process to enable? We'll see how close you can get to something like that. Doesn't matter if you don't get there, but take 5 minutes. Think about it in a really high level way, and then what we want to do is just run a poll of. See around the room who got to March for the basement works and who got to September for the main works. And then I'll share with you, I've got a printout of where I got to. I'm not for a minute saying you'd want to do this, it's just about the thought process of how you can do it. All right, good luck. All right, should we call it there and just see where you landed? Okay. By vote of hands, who got to basement works starting in March? Simon, Bosher, nicely done. You got it? Who got to April or May? Who couldn't get anything before sort of August? No? All right, interesting. And then in terms of the superstructure, anyone get September? No, all good. Right, let me show you what I came up with last night, which is lunacy, right? And that is the basis that we're having this discussion. Is I know this is insane, but how I would approach solving this problem and then working backwards, and I've got hard copies of this, so just over there, so feel free to take them on your way out, is I moved cost planning at the back end of the concept design phase and said to the client, look, you've got a week, mate, to sort it out. Preliminary design, I kept it the same duration. I didn't change the overall durations. In fact, I made detailed design longer. Off the back of PD, I still felt it was really important to get 100% PD and then do a cost plan and get it approved and make sure we've got some market process. So I left that in there for a few weeks.
But you still lodged the resource consent to UA, right? So there's still a
Yeah.
client that's prepared to accept. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what I was expecting is that off PD level, you know, the developmental journey on PD, that we should be able to engage with a tag or the urban design panel or something. But I was still saying don't lodge resource consent until you've finished PD, right? 2 concurrent sets of docs, whatever. And then I had the EPA going here just because I wanted to get it out of the way. I wasn't too fussed about whether that happened earlier or later. During develop design, I said, well, the only way we're going to get to a basement start here would be if we locked off the overall building geometry at PD, and if we agreed the retention system at PD for basement dig. Then I've got an advanced detailed design package. I'd see this as another structural team within the structural engineering group, focused just purely on retentions, excavation and foundations. After that, it normally takes us about 2 months to get a building consent ready to lodge through peer reviews and that sort of thing. So gave ourselves, by the looks of it, about 2.5 months to get through the advanced detailed design package and then get the building consent pack together. And then lodged the building consent for processing and uplift in the new year, knowing that you have to have resource consent and EPA before you can uplift any of your consents. Then I was sort of thinking if you're in a traditional program that you might, traditionally procured, you might do a tender based on PNG and margin and the BC1 information here, which enables you to start construction. Equally on a DNC world, you might do a full DNC tender here, or I'd certainly see that there'd be an advantage of getting the main contractor on board before detailed design starts in DNC world.
So would you have like a 50% development design package for that?
Oh, well, look, that looks like 75, right? And that would be it, right? And it is a negotiation. It's like, okay, so what can we be high level about and provisionalise because this client's clearly in a hurry, right? What about the fit out can we kick down the road, but really we can't wait for structure, facade and services. Then, where was I? So then had detailed design kicking along. I extended it to be 6 or 7 months or something like that. And then, but broke it into, a 4-month structure process of, sort of 3 to 4 month building services and facade process, and then something similar for interiors, and broke those out into consent. So you can see, though we're halfway through detailed design, what I'm saying is that we want to get to 100% of the structural design. And then there are things that we'll leave down the road and come to and just grow the overall detailed design process. But getting all the way through structure, being really clear about that, we're not worried about fit out yet. As long as we've got our columns and set outs and those sorts of things sorted, we can drive a building consent doc and peer review and then get it lodged. So anywho, that's how I saw it. And then I figured, we're going to be at least 6 months before we need a building services, fire engineering and facade consent, and then we really need to get up the structure before we can get into interiors. But yeah, so that kind of process is what I think about when I'm trying to match these things up, is that, if we were to say to the engineer, you've got 4 months to do detailed design, what is the minimum information you need with absolute certainty that we cannot unwind from that point without significant consequences? Communicate that to the rest of the consultant team and your client, but then actually protect that. Be quite discerning that while we're doing the structure piece, I actually am not interested in talking about interiors. We're going to do that really thoroughly later. And equally, what about during the structure phase? Give us 2 months to get our head straight on what we're doing here. Then be led by the structure. What building services stuff do you need to know around penetrations? What are the facade interfaces and setups that you want to protect? And look, the truth is, every time we program this, the program we go in with at the start, the only thing I can guarantee is it's 100% wrong, and it evolves along the way, right? And you're picking up pieces and adapting it. But it's more, and that's why I program in this way first. I'm thinking about it strategically and how I leverage the people I'm working with and our relationships with them. And at that point, I just need to shut up, I think.
Oh no, because what happens is the architect says, well, I need price to do up there. I haven't got the resources to do that, so I got all my resources on this other project because I priced it to do it the first way. So what are you going to say now, mate?
Well, we've been on board since concept design, so this was always the plan, right? That's got to be the basis of how you get engaged. And that's that thing about, that terrible Warren Buffett quote, and then, the noctuplets or whatever it's called, is that the acceleration isn't efficiency, right? And it is more expensive and it takes longer in an ultimate sense because you're doing things so far out of sequence and so disordered that it has inefficiencies and cost premiums and risk associated with it. You can only do it with eyes fully wide open. I would actually, every day of the week, rather go through a really clear, structured process and not have more and more layers of teams, but actually distribute when teams are working.
And the other thing is you would have to have a big design contingency, develop design contingency to cope with all those things that have been figured out. So that's a negotiation with the client as well.
Oh, for us as the builder?
Yeah.
Totally, but I mean the client, a mature client will have their own design contingencies. Being at developed design and not knowing what the end of the job, within 5-10% certainty or whatever, is pretty normal. So yeah, I mean we have a view on typically what happens on our jobs and what if we contract at preliminary design versus developed design versus detailed design, what our contingency levels would be. And we tend to carry two out of interest, design development, but also construction contingency, and we see the two as very different. But yeah, I mean, that again is the inefficiency of acceleration. If the client wants us to take that risk, they have to pay for it, and it has to be dealt with somewhere.
It's also just looking at the efficiency from a design perspective, because that engineer's going to have to over-engineer those foundations. There's no opportunity for, getting more efficient in terms of the amount of stuff you need because you've got to get to site.
Yes and no. What's good about this kind of process is it locks you into big dumb good really early, right? And I've had more issues with overcomplicated, too smart engineering than I have had with, look, we're just going to put a column in and we're not going to have a transfer and it's going to be a concrete structure all the way up. We're not going to have structural interfaces with different systems. You invest in that, but you make that decision early and stick to it, and then you build your construction tools and method and systems around it. The picture that I had at the start, which was, the way we had a jump form on Pacifica, part of the reason that the way that worked was that we took the columns and the core all up together and fully encapsulated the perimeter with screens. It was great. No one died. But, good safety outcome, but we poured a core and a slab every 6 days, right? It was pumping it. Now, the reason we could do that is because we had a simple, big, dumb, good structure. We took the complex and smart out of it and made it big and simple and invested in optimizing it with good technology and repeatability. So yeah, I'll quite happily pay a bit more for the foundations that you can lock in with certainty and make the most of.
And I was thinking more like, weights and other bits and pieces, like you can't optimise how much steel until you know a bit more about what the full design's going to be, which you don't know that early on in the piece. So as an engineer, you're going to kind of make some allowances and assumptions and be quite conservative because you have to be.
Totally.
And I don't know, I was actually just more interested in terms of how you kind of help a client to understand all that, or does that not? Is it just like you've signed up to this program, so you're going to deal with whatever we sort of?
No, I think, to my comment before, it comes with risk, right? You can't accelerate a program like this without risk of protectionism and also mistakes, and that you need to hold contingencies and that there are development risks. But the challenge is then to go, okay, so what are the things about this process what are the risks it generates, and then how do we respond to them? And you're not, it's kind of the 80-20 thing is, 20% of them are the ones that'll have 80% of the material effect. So if you're worried about, say, we go back to the foundation thing or the steel tonnage, then that's when we have to draw on benchmarking data, and we actually have to get into it in a bit more to say, well, mate, we've done however many towers with these kinds of slabs, and we see it in these ranges. Are you being honest with us? Because we don't need your conservatism on our contingency. We actually need to know what real is. But my personal view on Rio is that I've never got it right once, and it's always much, much worse than you ever planned. So what's the point of planning? Yeah.
So this is the program you were working on,
I just made this up last night. So
presumably, but what would the one that you show your client looks like?
yeah, interesting point.
If you're cramming everything out and you're chucking heaps of resource at it,
Yeah.
overlap the trades and
I think
design consultants and things.
What we'd look at is these commencement dates here. This is a net program for sure. These commencement dates, we'd put contingencies in there, right? Put it at the back. We have the same issue on our construction programs. When we try to be smart about hiding contingencies, what typically happens is that we forget where they are, and then we use them all up anyway. So we've moved to a basis of that we declare our contingencies on our programs at the back end, so that the target program is just cut that bit off and that's it, and then we draw down on the contingency as we go. It's a bit more transparent. I just don't have time for it. I mean, look at it. No time to have a coffee.
The reality is the project goes afloat and whoever gets to it first owns it, so you might as well declare it at the back end as you do.
Not if you declare it as contractor contingency, nobody can touch it, it belongs to you.
No, yeah, but I think this person that owns it. It's not the project's contingency. It's not the project. It's not the contract.
I think you also need to wind your thinking back to you might be in a head contract with contractors contingency on a program, but these sorts of processes for us typically happen within a much softer ECI rulebook, right? Where it's more open book because you're acting on behalf of the client to drive something. So, in terms of who owns it, or actually, it almost doesn't matter because there's not damages, right? But on the other side of it, there are damages for us because if the job doesn't start on time, then we've got a project team waiting with nothing to do. It hurts. There's a lot of that going on at the moment. But yeah. Anything else?
I just have a question about the interaction between the design manager and the actual project manager that's going to run the job.
Yep.
In what stage of the process you actually interact with this person that's gonna provide your buildability advice and all that stuff? Because it sounds like the PM has been left out of the picture.
So this is our this is our like bog standard structure for our business, and everyone's different, right? It depends on what scale you are. Some people have to share design management resources over a whole business, right? Sorry, there you go. But the way that we set our jobs up is that we have a project manager who's responsible for time, cost, quality, everything about the job, and then we have a design manager full-time on the job that reports into him. And then just like we've got a project engineer, guy looking after the QA and methodology and program, site manager actually running the job, right? HSE lead, and then commercial management lead. So that's, and how long is this person on the job? Typically they join the ECI early if we do an ECI. If we don't do an ECI, they're certainly there from the beginning of the job, probably until 6 to 12 months out from the end. The problem with design managers is that they typically, PMs are really protective around them and don't want them to leave. And it's too easy because they've set up in our world the building consent strategy and all that stuff, and they've got all the relationships with the consultants. There's lots of efficiencies of keeping them to the very end and using them to do your CCCs and all your final producer statements.
So that PM is right at the start as well, from concept potentially if you're engaged from.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the project, right? It depends on, I would expect that project team to be fully on board from this green box here, right? When we're sort of taking over and we're going fixed price on something. The preceding stages, if we're involved in that, it'd be an ECI team with an ECI lead and an estimator, and would slowly be adding the PM and the design manager and site manager into that, so that they go on the journey. The counterbalance is, and we set heaps in tenders, is that clients say, we want your project delivery team in the ECI team. And the problem is that our project teams, they like being on site and more in concrete, and that's being in an ECI is the opposite of it and drives them bloody nuts. And, it's different skills, so you kind of have to match it. So, yeah, my experience is build the team as you go through the ECI.
Yeah, a lot of the times when the project manager is not fully involved in that ECI stage, then you send them the drawings and they say, oh, we should have built it this way. And what do? Yeah, because you can spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
Like you said, if you engage the team, say, close it a few weeks before the commencement of the site, and then your building team says, well, this is a better way. What happened here?
I hear. I mean, we get the same thing even on just a program, right? You pull the project manager into the job and goes, what the fuck were you, what were you thinking? And it, they also tend to do these things when you're building a project team. They're reacting partly from, they haven't got their head in the job yet and they're looking at something they don't quite understand, but also people tend to carry with them the most recent scars from their last job into how they look at the thing that they're dealing with. And it actually takes a bit of time to actually differentiate out the noise and get people focused. But I actually feel that is more of a, that's a problem with ECI and starting teams rather than a design management thing. And what's happening in the market now is that, the need for design management and the fact that there are people that do it in the consulting space really well and people that do it in the building space really well. There's a huge need and they're all being brought forward into the design phase. That's a good thing. Then the tension around that is when can you reliably bank on the job starting so that you can commit the balance of your resource to it so that your PM can be in there for 6 months or 4 months building up to the job. But anyone doing residential in the current market probably can't pick when their next multi-res job starts within plus or minus 6 months at the moment, because that's what we're in the middle of, and it's pretty tricky. Yeah. I'm just conscious that Jennifer's looking keen to get up here. Yeah, so unless there's anything urgent, I might just hand over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Dan.
Graham. Thank you.